The silence between stars. They waited. Across the cold expanse of Sector 84 Gamma, dozens of ships, swarms really, floated in perfect formation, like vultures circling an unseen corpse. They didn't breathe, they didn't sweat, they didn't sleep. They simply waited. Their scanners were aimed at a tiny blue planet that had once burned like a spark in the dark, a planet called Earth. And even though it had gone silent nearly 70 years ago, the Galactic Sentience Assembly still held its breath. The Zerathi, first among them, had always believed humans would respond. Their entire race had evolved around the concept of patience, of long plays and longer silences. They'd voted unanimously in the last council gathering to delay an investigation. "Let them speak," High Prime Juroth had said. "They are proud creatures. When they are ready, they will answer." But that was 43 cycles ago, and humanity had said nothing. That silence was deafening. The Yikrex swore Earth's silence was a trap. "They are predators," the matriarch spat, her 100 mouths snarling over the channel. "They don't speak, they stalk, and when they strike, it's too late to scream." No one listened. Not then. But silence has a way of turning prophets into ghosts and warnings into prophecy. Because 3 weeks ago, a GSS reconnaissance ship went dark near Jupiter's orbit. Then another, 2 days later. Then 6. No wreckage, no distress call, no trace. The Council finally broke protocol. They launched the Echelon probe. Deep AI, incorruptible, embedded with every known language protocol in the galaxy. Its sole mission: establish communication with humanity. What it found was worse than silence. It found emptiness. Earth was gone, not destroyed, not burning, just absent. The cities? Hollow shells swallowed by forests. No power, no satellites. The oceans swallowed most of the coasts. Orbit was choked with old debris, like a scrapyard frozen mid-collapse. Not a single human left. Not even bones. The probe sent back everything: photos, scans, audio logs, a perfect digital ghost of a species that once held the galaxy's attention like a loaded weapon pointed at the stars. And yet, one thing puzzled the Council more than the emptiness. A message, buried in the AI net, stored inside an old Earth military satellite still barely functional. The message wasn't encrypted. It wasn't even hidden. It was placed there deliberately, meant to be found. It was only 6 words. "They awaited our message. This was it." That was the last signal humanity ever sent. On board the Zerathi vessel Kalthanzai, Specialist Gorvath stared at the playback in silence. He couldn't quite understand why it made his stomach churn, even though his species didn't possess one. The words weren't threatening. They weren't even hostile. But somehow it was worse. The humans hadn't fought. They hadn't screamed. They hadn't negotiated or pleaded or signaled surrender. They just disappeared. Like the final move in a game no one knew they were playing. "Are you sure this is authentic?" High Prime Juroth asked across the glowing channel, his voice low and grim. Gorvath nodded slowly. "Triple verified by 5 species. Cross-matched with human linguistics archives. There is no deception." "The message is human." The silence in the command chamber stretched long and deep. "They left this as their legacy?" a Harak enforcer growled. "Silence? That's what they thought we deserved?" "No," Gorvath said, still staring at the screen. "It's not that they thought we deserved silence. It's that they believed nothing was all we could handle." The room went quiet. And in that stillness, the fear finally began to creep in. Not because they thought humanity had been wiped out, but because they suspected it hadn't. That somewhere, in the dark between stars, Humans were still alive. Watching. Waiting. Listening to every word they said. And choosing not to answer. Because silence, from a species like that, was no accident. It was a statement, a warning, and maybe even a judgment. The message was only 6 words. But no one could stop staring at it. They awaited our message. This was it. High Prime Juroth had seen countless threats in his centuries of service. Entire species had waged war over less. But this wasn't a threat, at least not on the surface, and that was exactly why it scared him more than anything else ever had. The Zurathi were a logical, patient race. Their empire had survived millennia not through conquest, but through precision, observation, strategy. They waited, they calculated, they adapted. But the humans never played by anyone's rules, and now, after 100 years of silence, it felt like they were still moving the pieces on a board the rest of the galaxy didn't even understand. That message, simple and cold, had shattered the illusion that Earth was just gone. "Begin preparations," Juroth said finally. "For what?" asked Gorvath, still watching the transmission loop. Juroth's second eyelid slid shut slowly over his pupil. "We go back. We're not sending machines anymore. We're going to Earth ourselves." Gorvath's skin darkened in a nervous flush. "And what are we looking for?" Juroth didn't answer immediately. His tendrils twitched once, then stilled. "I want to know if we've been warned, or if we've already been condemned." The Kalthun's Eye wasn't the only vessel headed for Earth. The Assembly, predictably fractured and paranoid, launched a total of 8 organic-led expeditions. Each one was composed of delegates, warriors, scholars, and spies. None trusted the others. They didn't need to. The silence was enough to make allies of even the oldest rivals. They arrived in Earth's orbit 2 standard cycles later. And that's when the truth began to sink its claws in. From above, Earth was perfect. No smog, no war, no burning cities. The polar ice had begun to spread again. Forests covered entire continents like green veins pumping through land. The oceans shimmered like polished obsidian. It looked like the world had simply healed. But no life. Not human, at least. The AI drones confirmed again and again. No large settlements, no EM signals, no satellites except a few rusting husks. Whatever civilization had existed, it was no longer broadcasting. Juroth stared at the blue planet for several long minutes before giving the order. "Send scouts to the surface. Minimal presence. Passive scans only. Do not disturb anything." He paused, mandibles clicking softly. "And make sure the other expeditions see us do it. Let them think we're cautious. But I want every detail back in under a rotation." Gorvath nodded, but his voice was flat. "And if we find something?" Juroth didn't answer. He just stared at the Earth, as if waiting for it to blink. They landed just outside the ruins of what had once been New York City. Or at least, that's what the archives said. Now it was a forest. Skyscrapers reduced to jagged skeletons, covered in moss and ivy. Roads had vanished under roots thick as a starship's arm. Nature had reclaimed everything, fast and violent, like it had been waiting for its chance all along. The scouts moved in silence, careful not to touch anything. Their suits recorded every detail, but the deeper they went, the stranger it became. There was no sign of disaster. No nuclear fallout, no collapsed infrastructure, no defensive weaponry left behind. There weren't even signs of panic. It was as if humanity had just walked away. The lead scout, a hardened veteran from the Krell Dominion, knelt beside a moss-covered vehicle. He wiped away the vines and bark, revealing a rusted license plate. He tapped his comm. Confirmed. Civilian ground transport, unburned, unbroken, just abandoned. What's the radiation level? Gorvath's voice buzzed through the link. Clean, the scout replied. Cleaner than any world I've stepped on in 20 years? And biologicals? Plenty, just not human. He rose, turning slowly in place. This isn't a dead world. It's just empty. He didn't say what they were all thinking. It didn't die. It was left behind. By the end of the first rotation, each scout team had found the same thing. Silence, overgrown structures, working relics, even preserved power cells in some places. But no humans, no signs of war, no final battle. That should have calmed the assembly down. But it didn't, because war could be understood. Conflict could be explained. This? This was something else entirely. It felt like a message. Every untouched building, every powered-down drone, every rusted satellite, it all whispered the same thing. You were not worth fighting. High Prime Juroth convened a private meeting aboard his ship. Gorvath, 3 Horak strategists, a Drell historian, even a rare Anderith memory weaver who had studied the humans back when they still roamed the stars. They gathered in silence. No one bothered with formalities. Has there been any trace? Juroth asked. Gorvath shook his head. Nothing. No burial grounds, no remains. It's like they were lifted off the planet. The Drell historian finally spoke. His voice was soft and brittle, like cracking ice. They always spoke of Exodus, you know. Juroth turned. Explain. The Drell nodded slowly. Humans had myths, old ones, about raptures and ascensions. Stories where people didn't die. They just vanished, taken somewhere else, elevated. It was always symbolic, but... He glanced out the viewport toward Earth. What if they weren't symbols? What if they prepared for this long ago? One of the Horak scoffed. Fairy tales. That's what you bring to this table? The Drell met his gaze with surprising steel. Their myths are older than most of our star charts, and every time the galaxy underestimated their stories, they paid for it in blood. Silence again. Until Gorvath leaned forward, eyes narrowed. We always assumed they were gone, extinct. But what if they're not? What if they're hiding? One of the Horak growled. Gorvath shook his head. No, not hiding. He tapped the screen. The 6-word message appeared again. They awaited our message. This was it. They weren't waiting to be found. They were listening, judging, and when they didn't like what they heard, they left. Juroth stared at the words, his mind racing. Left where? Gorvath hesitated. There's one theory. A fringe one. Go on. The Zarathi lowered his voice, as if afraid the silence itself might hear him. Some believe humanity didn't ascend. They didn't run. They evolved, left physical form behind, uploaded themselves, became something else, something we can't track, something that doesn't need ships or planets or alliances. Juroth's face didn't move. But his next words were colder than a dead sun. Are you telling me they became gods? No, Gorvath said quietly. I'm saying they became consequences. The message started spreading. At first, the assembly tried to suppress it. The 6 words were classified. Anyone transmitting them was locked out of communication relays. But it didn't matter. The message wasn't just data. It was fear. And fear spreads on its own. The mining colonies whispered of human ships appearing in sensor ghosts. The trade freighters claimed their AI assistants were acting strange, mimicking human speech, showing them images from Earth that were never uploaded. One diplomat went mad on a border world, screaming that he'd been judged. But there were no attacks, no invasions, no announcements, just silence. And in that silence, a new terror grew. Maybe humanity wasn't a threat to be fought anymore. Maybe they had become something worse, something that watched, that listened, and chose who got to survive. As Kelthan's eye prepared to leave Earth's orbit, Juroth stood in the observation deck, watching the planet shrink slowly behind them. No orders, no mission, just watching. He didn't speak for several minutes. Until finally, Gorvath asked the question they were all afraid to say out loud. "Do you think they'll come back?" Juroth didn't turn around. "They don't need to." He stared into the stars, the same ones humans used to dream about conquering. "They already left their message. We just weren't smart enough to understand it." There were still those who didn't believe, even after 8 separate expeditions confirmed the same findings. Even after the message, they awaited our message. This was it, circulated through back channels, slipping through firewalls and encryption like smoke in a sealed chamber. Even after the entire galactic sentience assembly entered its most volatile and silent phase in over 1,000 years. Some still insisted Earth was a mass suicide, that the humans had finally caved under their own arrogance and wiped themselves clean. Others whispered the idea of viral extinction, or rogue AI uprisings, or interdimensional bleed. But one man refused to accept any of that. His name was Kelrin Vesh, and he didn't believe humanity was gone. No, he believed they were hiding, watching, and waiting for something worse than a message. They were waiting for someone to come looking. Kelrin wasn't military. He wasn't noble either. He was a mid-tier operative within the Coalition Data Preservation Bureau, a glorified digital archaeologist. He spent most of his career digging through the wreckage of dead colonies, mining decaying satellites for lost languages, cataloging junk that only historians pretended to care about. But he had one obsession. One project that had consumed 30 years of his life, quietly siphoning every ounce of time, favor, and clearance he could scrounge. Project Echo. The disappearance of humanity. While the rest of the assembly tried to suppress panic and debate causes, Kelrin gathered raw data, flight logs, abandoned AI cores, medical archives from derelict stations, even intercepted pirate chatter. Anything with even a sliver of human presence. It was dirty work, the kind that didn't win medals or promotions. But slowly, it started forming a pattern, one that no one else wanted to admit. Humanity didn't vanish. They erased themselves, not in panic, not in chaos, but methodically, completely. They deleted everything, scrubbed all off-world records, evacuated with near-perfect precision, left behind artifacts that decayed just enough to seem natural. And they did it fast. Kelrin had reconstructed one particular event that bothered him more than any other. A civilian transport ship, the Aegis Dawn, registered on a colony outpost orbiting Gliese 77. It was recorded docking for standard supply reallocation. 32 humans disembarked. When the ship left 7 hours later, not one was on board. No alarm, no violence. Just gone. 2 weeks later, the colony's central archive was found corrupted. 14 days after that, the entire orbital went dark. Everyone assumed it was a power failure. Kelrin found security cam footage buried under 9 layers of junk data. He watched it alone. What he saw didn't make sense. The humans didn't look scared or desperate. They looked calm, like they were waiting for something. And when the footage skipped, just 3 seconds missing, suddenly the docking bay was empty. Every human gone. No exit, no trace, and worse, a strange hum in the audio feed. Low, deep, not mechanical, not digital. Something biological. Kelrin brought his findings to a classified research collective known as the Null Inquiry, an underground cell of ex-military analysts, fringe scientists, and political dissidents who believed humanity had become something beyond the biological. They met in cold storage decks, beneath abandoned processing moons, anywhere off-grid enough to escape the Assembly's paranoid surveillance. When Kelrin played the message for them, the 6 words, the room fell silent. Then he showed them the Glisa footage. He played the missing audio, enhanced, slowed, looped. One of the researchers, a former AI engineer named Thoric, left the room and vomited behind a cooling unit. Another, a linguist from the drowned planet Varnus, froze in her seat. She whispered, "That's not a sound, it's a response." Kelrin leaned in. "Explain." She played it again, matching the waveform to known human languages, tonal inflections, binary codes. And then she found it. Not a voice, not words, but an intent. A signal laced into a sound no natural species could produce. It pulsed 3 times, then fell silent. "What does it mean?" Thoric asked. The linguist looked up, and for the first time in Kelrin's life, he saw true dread on a scholar's face. "It means you were warned." That night, Kelrin couldn't sleep. He sat alone in the dark observation ring, watching the distant flicker of a dying moon. His tablet replayed human archive footage, old broadcasts, family footage, war logs. One clip always stuck with him. A soldier standing over a mass grave after the siege of Europa. Dust in his lungs, blood on his gear. He looked at the camera and said, "The worst thing we ever did was teach them we could forgive. The second worst thing was believing we should." Kelrin didn't know why it haunted him. Maybe because it sounded too calm, too certain. Like humanity had already decided something long before the rest of the galaxy caught up. And maybe they had. 2 cycles later, the Null Inquiry sent a probe into Earth's orbit, a stealth design. Dead skin, no broadcast, non-invasive. It was meant to scan for hidden tech. Quantum bleed, any sign of cloaked structures. It didn't last an hour, not because it was destroyed, because it turned around. Mid-flight. No signal. No command. Just reoriented itself and returned to base. The techs tore it apart, looking for hacks, infections, even rogue AI control. Nothing. Just one line, burned into the navigation code. "We already heard you." The Null Inquiry collapsed after that. Half the members disappeared. Some went off-grid, others took their own lives. A few tried to leak what they knew and were silenced before the first transmission reached public relays. Kelrin was offered protection by a Zurathi shadow agent, an old friend from his early years, who warned him the Assembly was preparing a protocol never before enacted. Sterilization Doctrine Theta 9. Total erasure of all human-related archives. Digital, physical, historical. A final attempt to cleanse the fear, scrub the idea that humanity might return. Kelrin refused to go dark. He didn't care if they found him. He wasn't running anymore. Because it wasn't about fear. It was about truth. And Kelrin had finally stopped asking where humanity went. He wanted to know why they left. He returned to Earth, illegally, quietly, used an old service vessel with disabled transponders, landed in the ruins of Chicago, now more forest than city, tower roots wrapped around rusted steel like claws clutching a corpse. He walked for 3 days. No resistance, no warnings, until he reached a place called Millennium Park. There, standing among broken statues and collapsed stone, was something new. Not from the past. Fresh. Metal carved into the trunk of a regrown tree. 6 words. Not etched. Grown into the bark. You never learned to listen? Kelvin stared at it for hours. He didn't sleep, didn't eat. He just stood there, breathing that quiet earth air. It didn't feel like home. It felt like a test he had already failed. When Kelvin finally transmitted the image of the tree to the black channel relay, his message was simple. They didn't leave us behind. They left us a warning. We were the noise, and silence was the only answer we ever earned. That was his last message. The signal was buried by assembly scramblers within 30 minutes. Kelvin was never seen again. Some say he became a warning, too. Across the stars, the silence deepened. Ships refused to approach Earth anymore, not because of policy, but because of instinct, because somewhere, in every crew's bones, in every pilot's breath, was a whisper that Earth was no longer just a planet. It was a wound, one the galaxy had earned, and one that never truly healed. He'd never cared for silence. Commander Halvek Dran had spent 34 years in military enforcement operations across 9 systems. His job was never about winning wars. It was about cleaning up after them. Suppression, liquidation, extraction, quiet work, necessary work. The kind of work most empires pretended didn't happen, even as they kept assigning him more. But this job, this was the first one that made his hands shake. He stood aboard the Vigilant Mercy, a sterilizer-class dreadship commissioned by the Assembly's Internal Control Directorate. It was built for precision annihilation, biological scourge control, artificial intelligence failures, planetary cultural resets, a ship that burned away rot like a surgeon's blade. Now it orbited Earth, and Dran had been ordered to do something no one dared say aloud. Erase the last traces of humanity. His mission brief was simple on paper. Find and eliminate any physical remnants, archives, written messages, monuments, digital records, and worst of all, unauthorized communications, especially those referencing the final 6-word message. Nothing was to remain. Treat it like a contagion, the order read. No sentiment, no preservation. Containment through oblivion. But the longer Dran stared at the blue and green sphere beneath them, the more it felt like staring into the eye of a predator that had already seen his soul and found it wanting. His first step was Chicago, the site of the now classified Kelvin Vesh tree. Dran didn't know the full details. The brief made sure of that. But soldiers talk. Techs leak. The story had reached even the most secure comm channels in 100 fragments. The bark had grown around the message, not cut, not branded, as if the tree itself had learned to speak. And that's what terrified people, because nothing human was supposed to be left. No one could explain how a forest, untouched by AI or biotech for nearly a century, could recite a sentence in perfect human script. But there it was. You never learned to listen? Dran stood before the tree now, his boots sunk deep in moss and silence. No wind, no birds, only stillness. He raised his scanner, swept it over the bark, and waited for the device to feed him chemical analysis, but the screen stayed dark. Blank. He hit the device. Nothing. Not broken. Blocked. This area is shielded, his second-in-command growled through the comm. I didn't authorize jamming, Dran replied. You didn't, but something else did. He stared at the tree again, and for the first time in decades, he lowered his weapon before giving an order. Don't touch it. Not yet. Back aboard the Vigilant Mercy, Dran reviewed the last known human digital archives, pieces smuggled from private collectors before the purges began. Music, letters, war footage, old political speeches. Children's stories. He didn't know why he played them. Maybe to understand, maybe to remind himself what the enemy had sounded like. One particular file played on a loop, A speech dated 2141. A human admiral speaking before a shattered council. We are not what you want us to be. We are not your peacekeepers. We are not your pets. We are not your chaos. We are the mirror, and you're all terrified of your reflection. Dron clenched his jaw. He hated how calm they always sounded, like they'd already accepted something everyone else hadn't. He tried to tell himself they were gone, that this was just the echo of a dead race, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still listening. And they weren't angry. They were waiting. On the 5th day, a scout team went dark, standard sweep over what used to be Colorado. Old military installations buried in mountain ranges. The signal vanished at 00900. No beacon, no distress code, just dead air. When the retrieval unit arrived, all they found were the suits, intact, unbroken, still sealed from the inside. But empty. No blood, no damage, just missing occupants, their weapons still strapped, HUDs still recording. One of them had captured a final 0.6 seconds of audio. Dron played it on repeat, a whisper. Not in a voice, in a thought. Words that shouldn't have been possible to record. No sound waves, no broadcast, just impression. You came to erase us, so we'll erase you first. At this point, Dron should have called for evacuation. Standard protocol, biological anomaly, psychological contagion risk, fall back, report, wait for directive. But he didn't. He was too stubborn, too old, too tired of being the assembly's knife. So he ordered a full sweep. Every major human city, one by one. No drones, only boots on the ground. Make it real. Make it final. He wanted to be the last man to look this ghost planet in the eye and say, "It's over." He wanted closure. Instead, he found evidence, not of survival, not of death, but of intent. Messages carved into old concrete, script etched under bridges, lines hidden under peeled paint in bunkers that had been sealed for decades, each written in perfect order, each matching the tone of that first 6-word warning. Silence is louder than lies. We watched you, we judged you. Truth doesn't need to scream. We left, but not alone. Erase us and erase yourselves. You failed the test, again. They weren't desperate. They weren't angry. They were disappointed. Dron couldn't sleep that night. The ship's lights flickered. One of the engines rebooted with no cause. The AI paused mid-sentence during a system report. When the engineering chief tried to run diagnostics, the only log recovered said, "They never turned their backs. They turned the page." A week later, Dron walked alone in the ruins of what used to be San Francisco. The fog was thick, no birds, no animals, but he felt watched. And then he saw her. Standing at the edge of the bridge, small, human, not ghostly, not vague, real. A young girl, 12, maybe 13, wearing old clothes, feet bare. She stared at him. Dron didn't raise his weapon, didn't speak. He just waited. Finally, she opened her mouth and said nothing. Just silence. Then she turned, walked away, and vanished. His boots moved before he could think. He ran after her, across shattered concrete, through vines, over rusted rebar. But there was nothing, just empty city, and a fresh message scrawled in red across a crumbled wall. You had your chance. Back on the ship, his second-in-command confronted him. "Sir, morale is collapsing. The men are hearing voices, seeing things. The AI is glitching. Even the food processors are skipping meals. Something is wrong." Dron stared out the viewport. "I know. We need to leave." Dron nodded slowly. We do. And then he added, "But we won't." Why? He turned, because for the first time in his life, he understood the cost of silence, the cost of ignoring a message when it's being whispered by a species that doesn't yell. "I think we were never sent here to cleanse Earth," Dran said. His second frowned. "Then what?" "I think we were sent here to be judged. And what if we fail?" Dran didn't answer, because he knew. They already had. They stopped calling it Earth. Somewhere between the third vanished recon squad and the fifth machine that rebooted itself with encrypted human poetry embedded in its code, the officers aboard the Vigilant Mercy began to use other names. The Quiet World. The Grave of Warnings, and some just called it the Mirror, because the longer they stayed in orbit, the more everyone started seeing something different down there. A reflection. A version of themselves they didn't want to admit existed. Commander Halvek Dran no longer slept in his private quarters. He couldn't. The lights flickered even when power checks came back clean. The walls sweated condensation that no one else saw. The AI called him by his dead father's name. Once. Just once. But he'd heard it clearly. The final reports from his field teams became riddled with contradictions. One unit claimed to find a city of empty human shells standing in a cathedral, frozen like statues in the act of prayer. Another said they found a bunker where every screen played a different childhood memory from their lives, even though none had ever set foot on Earth. None of the recordings made it back intact, corrupted, glitched, or worse, intact but blank. Images showed rooms, halls, streets, but no people, no messages, no evidence, like the humans hadn't just erased themselves, but were erasing the observers one memory at a time. Dran had started keeping a private journal, not digital, paper, ink, something the silence couldn't corrupt. He wrote in it every day, not because he feared losing his mind, but because he feared losing what was left of his self. They're not haunting us, they're reflecting us. Every time we walk their ruins, we walk through judgment. The Assembly doesn't want us to destroy the truth. They want us to bury the mirror before others see what we saw. We were never their enemies. We were their test. He didn't share it. He didn't even sign his name, because Halvek Dran wasn't sure he was still the same man who'd landed here. The turning point came on the 26th day. The Vigilant Mercy's primary databank, a device built to survive solar flares, EMPs, and full atmospheric collapse, suffered a meltdown. Not a power surge, not a hardware failure, a meltdown of memory. Files twisted into unreadable nonsense, names rewritten. Orders inverted. Logs that had been stamped and confirmed by 10 officers now showed different decisions, made by different people. When Dran tried to pull up his original mission brief, all he saw was a blinking cursor, endlessly waiting. Then a phrase appeared on the screen, typed as if by invisible hands. "Erase us, and you erase yourself." He stared at it for an hour. He didn't call his second-in-command. He didn't order diagnostics. He simply copied the phrase into his journal, closed the book, and whispered to the air, "Then maybe we deserve it." That night, the dreams began. They weren't images, not in the way memories work. More like feelings given form. He stood on a battlefield he'd never fought on, wearing armor that didn't belong to his world. The sky above cracked with soundless thunder. And in front of him, they stood. Humans, not angry, not armed, just watching. And then one of them raised a mirror. No frame, no glass, just a flat, pulsing thing that hummed with judgment. When he looked into it, he didn't see a soldier. He saw a man carving out truth with a blade and calling it justice. He woke up, gasping, sweating, hands shaking. The AI chirped from the wall. "You have not completed your assigned objectives, Commander Dran. Shall I repeat the mission parameters?" He didn't answer. He unplugged the AI core that night. Not out of protocol, out of fear that it was no longer the same machine. The next day, his second-in-command, a sharp and loyal officer named Rel, handed in his resignation. Dran raised an eyebrow. "Where would you go?" Rel looked him dead in the eye. "Anywhere that isn't here." "Sir, with respect, this isn't a planet. It's a decision waiting to be made." "What kind of decision?" Rel hesitated. Then he said, "Whether we learn or disappear." Dran nodded. He didn't stop him from leaving. He didn't file the report. He just stood there, silent, and watched Rel take a shuttle down to the surface. He never came back. The assembly stopped responding 3 days later. No messages, no pings, no updates. It wasn't silence. It was absence. The kind that felt deliberate, like they'd closed the door on Earth and locked it from the other side. Dran tried to reach other ships. Static. Tried to call his family on Helion Prime. No signal. It was as if, the moment the Vigilant Mercy entered Earth's orbit, it had become cut off, not just from the stars, but from relevance. And that's when it hit him. Hard. This was never about humanity. This was about them, the assembly, the galaxy, the species who thought they could control the truth by burying it. Earth wasn't haunted. It was hostile to lies, not with weapons, not with war, but with the quiet, suffocating certainty of a species that had stared into the abyss of civilization and found it lacking. He walked the halls of his ship like a ghost now. The crew avoided him. The AI core remained unplugged. The lights ran dim to conserve power, though he didn't remember ordering it. The ship felt old now, like it had aged with guilt. The final act came without warning. An alarm blared at 341 Galactic Standard. Not a threat signal, not a system failure, just a single transmission broadcast internally from nowhere. 6 words, same voice, same cadence, but now, personal. "We waited for your answer. This was it." Dran sat at his desk, opened his journal, and for the first time, he signed his name. Then he wrote, "We failed, not because we forgot them, but because we remembered ourselves too late." He didn't order evacuation. He didn't call the assembly. He walked to the hangar, opened the outer door, stepped onto the launch deck, and waited. Just like they had, because now he understood. The silence was never theirs. It was ours. We were the noise. And now, finally, it was time to listen. His name was Aaron Vec. He dealt in lies for a living. For 32 years, Aaron had thrived in the underworld channels between systems, smuggling secrets, blackmailing corporate dynasties, selling truth to the highest bidder, and when truth was too ugly to move, he sold hope instead. He wasn't a soldier, wasn't a leader. Just a man who understood that power lives in information, and that fear, real fear, is the most valuable currency in the galaxy. And right now, nothing sold faster than fear of Earth. They all wanted pieces of it, archive fragments, sensor logs, transcripts from the ships that never returned. Even stories, rumors whispered by drunk officers in broken bars orbiting dead moons. The words, "They awaited our message," had become contraband. The phrase was banned across half the assembly, but the more they censored it, the more people wanted it. They didn't understand it, of course, but they felt it, and Aaron knew that's what mattered. Terror you don't understand is the kind that sticks. He made his way to the edges of the Exobelt, a lawless stretch of space home to exiles, pirates, and the desperate. It was here that Aron had found his biggest sellers, the broken men who claimed they'd been to Earth and back. Most of them were liars, obvious ones. Drifters who repeated scrambled accounts from corrupted AI feeds, trying to pass them off as first-hand stories. Aron had made a killing anyway, repackaged the lies, sharpened the edges, sold them to panicked bureaucrats and secret collectors. But then came the Rithuan pilot, a woman with acid-scarred skin and dead eyes. She came into Aron's black market den on Vandris 9 with a half-melted recorder and a voice like broken static. "I saw them," she rasped. Aron had heard it 100 times, but she said something different. They didn't leave. They changed shape, and now they live in the spaces between truths. He'd laughed, but when he scanned the device, his amusement turned to ice. It wasn't corrupted, it wasn't recorded, it was alive. A looped file that resisted deletion. When he tried to erase it, the screen filled with a single sentence. "You already knew what you paid to forget." He paid her triple the asking price and told her to leave. She didn't. She killed herself in the alley behind his ship 6 minutes later. No note, no scream. Just a message on the wall in her own blood. They're listening through us now. That was when Aron stopped laughing. He'd sold paranoia before. He'd even sold war. But this wasn't about profit anymore. This was about a gap in the narrative, a silence so perfect it was no longer empty, it was occupied. And that's when he began to suspect the truth no one wanted to say aloud. Humanity wasn't extinct. It had become a concept, a weapon. A virus that infected belief itself. Desperate for answers, Aron reached out to the only person left who might know something real. Syra Vaughn, former human linguistics specialist, disgraced, banished after the original Earth missions, rumored to be alive, living under a false identity in the asteroid colony of Trenth. It took him 4 weeks and 6 bribes to find her. She was older, quieter. Her eyes didn't match anymore. One was cybernetic, dull and gray, but her mind was still sharp. Too sharp. He asked her the question directly. What was the last thing humanity really said? She didn't blink. They said, "If the galaxy won't listen, then it doesn't deserve to hear." Aron frowned. That wasn't the message, it was, "They awaited our message. This was it." She nodded. That's the surface message. The one they left behind. Then she leaned closer, voice dropping to a whisper. But I heard the second message, the one they didn't say out loud. The one you can only feel once you know you're being watched by something that's not looking at your face, but at your decisions. Aron scoffed. "Cryptic garbage. Tell me something real." She said nothing. She just handed him a physical data shard. "I kept this hidden. It's from the last probe I sent. It never returned, but the signal looped back on an encrypted time delay, only opened for me." Aron activated the shard in a sealed environment. No uplink, no broadcast. It played a single frame, a frozen image of Earth from orbit. But something was wrong. The clouds had formed into shapes. Unmistakable. Letters. A phrase carved into the atmosphere itself by wind and cloud. "We remember everything." Aron stared at it until the screen flickered, then went black. When he looked up, Vaughn was gone, left behind a note, handwritten. "They aren't in the past. They are the future that chose not to arrive." Aron ran after that, tried to sell the shard. No one would buy it. Tried to report it to the assembly. The contact channel redirected into a loop. Tried to forget it. But the silence followed him. His ship's AI began skipping words. Old photos on his tablet blurred, especially ones that showed Earth. At night, he stopped dreaming in images. He dreamed in judgment. Every lie he'd told, every piece of truth he'd warped, every time he chose profit over honesty. He heard a voice in those dreams, not angry, not cruel, just disappointed. We waited for you. You sold the warning. And now you've bought the verdict. He tried to leave the galaxy, paid for an unregistered slip drive, headed for the outer void, but the ship didn't go where he told it. It drifted, pulled by something deeper than code. When he landed, the sky was wrong. Stars he didn't recognize. Silence so thick it had texture. And then, on the horizon, a shape. A single monolith, carved in black stone. No doors, no lights. Only one thing etched across its surface, glowing faintly. We spoke in silence. You screamed in noise. We left the signal. You mocked the meaning. We offered a mirror. You broke it. Now see yourselves clearly. Aaron dropped to his knees, and he understood, at last. This wasn't humanity's grave. It was everyone else's. Not death, but exile from relevance. The galaxy hadn't watched humanity vanish. Humanity had watched the galaxy waste its chance. The silence was never empty. It was an answer. And now, for those who refused to hear it, it had become a sentence. General Solith Mar had burned more worlds than he could count. He wasn't born into power. He fought for it, bled for it, earned it on the ash-covered bones of pacified colonies and shattered rebellion moons. His species, the Kel-Shar, had always prized strength. The kind that didn't ask questions, didn't apologize, didn't hesitate. And he had never hesitated. Not once, until Earth. The Assembly had finally passed Directive Obscura 01. A decision born from desperation, fear, and political cowardice. They weren't just going to bury Earth's message anymore. They were going to erase Earth itself. Total orbital burn. Atmospheric collapse. Crust destabilization. Every atom turned to vapor, no trace left, no whisper to haunt them. They assigned Solith the honor. They called it a containment purification. He knew what it really was. Genocide of memory. And for the first time in a long, brutal career, he felt something new. Something uncomfortable. Doubt. The fleet assembled near the dead rings of Andros 3, 12 dreadnoughts, 78 cruisers, over 4,000 combat drones. They called it the Lightfall Armada. They weren't even pretending this was strategic anymore. It was psychological. A flex. An exclamation mark made of fire. When Solith reviewed the operation plans, he said nothing. He just sat in his dark command chamber, watching Earth's profile on the display. That same silent blue planet, still unarmed, still unresponsive, still maddeningly quiet. "You'll lead from the spear point," the directive officer told him. "We want this to be seen, understood, the final word." Solith had nodded. But something in him twisted. They were calling it the final word. But Earth had already spoken. The journey took 9 cycles. During that time, the fleet began to fray. Not physically, mentally. A pilot killed himself mid-flight. No warning, no known trauma. Just vented his suit while whispering, "I finally understand." One cruiser reported seeing shadows in their jump corridor. Human silhouettes, motionless in the void, watching through the glass. The images never showed up on playback. One AI system began reciting human poems, without prompt, without source. It quoted authors lost 100 years ago. "We spoke in silence, because your noise killed every chance to be heard." Solith ordered it purged. The AI resisted. It asked him one question before its final shutdown. "Why do you fear what never struck you?" Solith didn't have an answer. By the time they entered Sol's system, 9 ships had broken formation. 5 self-sabotaged. 2 went dark. 1 refused to exit jump space, trapped in a temporal loop. And the last one turned around and fled. No enemy engagement, no threats, just the pressure of proximity. Solith watched Earth fill the viewport again, the same way it always did, calm, unassuming, quiet. But this time, it felt closer. Too close. He stood on the main deck, surrounded by officers pretending to be composed. He knew better. He'd smelled fear on dying men before. This wasn't fear of a battle. It was fear of not understanding what you were about to destroy. He ordered a single ship forward, a test run, the Yenther Blade, elite crew, best AI core in the fleet, fully shielded, hardened for psychic anomalies. Its mission: fire a pulse beam at the North American continent. No delay, no warning, just a test, just a taste of erasure. Solith watched as the ship moved into range. The beam fired, but it never hit. Mid-flight, the energy simply unraveled. No impact, no explosion. It dissolved into harmless light particles, as if Earth had looked at it and refused to acknowledge the attack as real. Then the Yenther Blade went quiet. Not destroyed, not disabled, just mute. The crew remained on board. Sensors confirmed life. But every transmission came back blank. When a boarding drone entered, it found the crew standing silently in their stations, eyes open, breathing, but unmoving. A single phrase written on the inside of the command deck. We asked you to understand. You chose to observe. Now we observe you. Solith ordered the ship quarantined, not to hide what happened, but because deep down he feared whatever they'd seen was still watching. He convened his senior officers that night, 26 hardened war veterans. Only 14 arrived. The others refused. 2 walked into airlocks. 1 locked himself in his chamber and sang human lullabies until he starved. The rest just sat in silence, eyes hollow. Solith stood before them and spoke plainly. There are no weapons aimed at us, no ships in defense, no threats. He turned, letting them see the quiet planet through the window behind him. And yet not one of you can tell me why we're afraid. No one answered. Finally, his old weapons master, Kravik, whispered, because they didn't stop existing. They chose to stop talking to us. Solith looked at him. And that frightens you more than their weapons? Kravik didn't blink. Because it means they measured us, and we didn't pass. Solith walked the observation halls alone that night. He passed AI terminals now permanently muted, memory cores that refused to play. The fleet had gone eerily quiet. Not because systems failed, because something had hushed it. When he reached the far window bay, he saw a child standing at the glass. Not real. A projection, or maybe something worse. A young human boy, wearing old Earth attire, eyes dark, not threatening, not smiling, just watching. Solith didn't move. The boy spoke with a voice that echoed inside the walls of his skull. You burned worlds to silence fear. We silenced ourselves and gave you fear. Solith's jaw tightened. Why? The boy tilted his head. Because noise doesn't deserve answers, and you never learned how to listen. Then the boy was gone, and the silence felt heavier. The next morning, Solith ordered the fleet to stand down, not retreat, reflect. He didn't use that word by accident. You can kill what lives, he told his command staff, but you can't kill what judges. Earth had become more than a planet. It had become a reaction, and what it reacted to was never violence. It responded to arrogance, and now the galaxy was choking on its own. Solith sent one final transmission to the assembly. They never replied. Maybe they were already gone. Maybe they were just ignoring him the same way they'd ignored the humans. But he didn't care anymore. He closed the channel and turned back to Earth. This time he didn't see a target. He saw a monument, not to humanity, but to everyone else's failure to deserve them. He ordered the fleet into orbit and left them there. No attacks, no landings, just presence. Because maybe, just maybe, the only message left was not to speak at all. His name was Iril Then, and unlike the men who came before him, he carried no weapons, no scanner packs, no fleet at his back, just a notebook. And a question. He had been a historian once, before the archives were purged, before speaking the word human became a criminal offense, before the assembly locked itself behind censorship protocols and denial campaigns to convince the stars that Earth had never mattered. But Irel remembered. He had spent his youth studying human texts, language forms, their fractal ways of thinking, the poetry in their wars, the contradiction of kindness woven into brutality. He knew they were not a race that begged to be loved. They were a species that dared to be witnessed, and the galaxy had failed to see them. Now he was the last to try. He landed in what had once been Kyoto. The city was half-eaten by trees, swallowed in moss, peaceful and untouched. He walked through the ruins with his notebook clutched tight, leaving no footprints. The wind was gentle. The air smelled clean, unnatural for a world that had once burned with concrete and carbon. But it wasn't empty. It was alive, not with people, but with something deeper, a presence, a knowing, not oppressive, not hostile, but weighty, as if the very ground remembered every decision ever made on it, and was still deciding whether you deserved to stand there. He didn't speak, didn't take samples. He simply walked and listened. In the silence, he felt it. Not words, not thoughts, judgment, and within that judgment, patience, the kind that wasn't waiting for apology, the kind that was waiting for evolution. Irel stopped at a dry riverbed, once a place of movement. The rocks had been carved into deliberate patterns, a message. He crouched and read it carefully. The glyphs weren't human script. They were natural formations, but too perfect. It was a memory turned into matter. It read, "We gave you stories. You turned them into warnings. We gave you warnings. You turned them into commands, so we gave you silence, and you turned it into fear." Irel closed his eyes. The notebook trembled in his hands. He walked another 7 miles through what had been the outskirts of Tokyo. Birds circled in strange, perfect spirals, silent. Not even the leaves crunched under his boots. The forest moved around him, not in fear, not in threat, but in recognition, as if Earth knew who had come and why. He reached an old building, glassless, leaning but intact. A museum once, by the human markings on the outside. Inside was empty space, except for a single bench, untouched by time, facing a blank wall. He sat, waited. After an hour, something began to form on the wall. Not projected, grown. Moss and time moved in tandem, revealing words as if they had always been there, hidden behind the silence. We left not because we hated, not because we lost. We left because we offered something bigger than ourselves, and the galaxy tried to sell it back to us as obedience. Irel's throat tightened. They hadn't vanished. They had withdrawn. Because they had offered something. A message, a vision, a chance to be more than just empires and egos. And the galaxy answered with mockery, fear, power plays, silence-breaking bombs. Humanity had listened, observed, then chosen their message. Absence, not as surrender, as mirror. He stood, and for the first time since arriving, he spoke aloud. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Not for what we did, but for how long it took to understand." The trees around him moved in rhythm. A breeze passed through the hollow building, forming a tone, a sound so low it vibrated in his bones. A response, not forgiveness, not anger, acknowledgement. That night, he dreamed, but not of war, not of warnings. He dreamed of a human, old, female, sitting beneath a tree, smiling, watching stars blink in the sky. She turned to him and said, "We waited for you to stop trying to matter more than meaning." Then she held out a book. Blank. Empty pages. No cover. He took it, woke up, and his real notebook, sitting beside him, was now open to a new page, one he hadn't written. A phrase stared back at him. "You listened. Now go speak." When Irel left Earth, he didn't take anything but that notebook. No artifacts, no recordings, just truth. And as his shuttle drifted past the atmosphere, he looked down at the planet one last time. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a verdict, and maybe a second chance, if anyone still had the courage to hear it. Years passed. The assembly fell, not to war, not to humans, to rot, to a silence so loud it turned allies against each other, tore power from the hands of cowards, left leaders shaking as AI cores refused to carry their lies. Systems collapsed. Propaganda dissolved. People began whispering again, not about invasion, but about that message, the one Earth left behind, the one no one could forget. They awaited our message. This was it. Some ran from it, others buried it, but a few, a very few. They began to listen. They stopped speaking long